Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the boneless chuck. This is located at the front part of the cow, its chest cavity, and upwards to part of its neck. And since we're only working with the boneless chuck, we're going to skip over a first couple cuts on the list here because those are referring to bone-in chuck. So after all your bones have been removed and you just have the boneless chuck roll, we'll show you a couple cuts that you can get out of the boneless chuck. Alright, the first cut we're going to talk about is the boneless center cut chuck roast, the boneless chuck steak, the Denver steak, a chuck eye roast, and the chuck eye steak. And let's get started. Most grocery stores today get what they call a boneless chuck roll, and that's after all your bones have been removed, your plate bones, your mock tender. After all that exterior muscles have been removed, you get what they call a center cut chuck roll, and that's what we're working with today. And the first thing I do is I take and I flip it over to the bottom side and I take off as much skin or as much extra fat or gristle or anything on there that's not very appealing to want to eat. I'll go ahead and trim that off to where I get a nice clean piece of meat to start with. The next thing I'm going to do after I trim the bottom off is take like the first 4 or 5 inches off the ribeye end, the end that connects to the large end of your ribeye, right where they break it. So I'm going to take that 4 or 5 inches off, and then, alright, if you notice this large vein of fat that runs through the middle here, this is where we're going to separate these two pieces of meat. The bottom half is your chuck eye, and the top portion, the cap muscle, if we clean that up, most of the time you can get some nice boneless short ribs out of that, but this piece here that we're working with just didn't have enough to do that with, so we used it for trim. But we'll go ahead and continue on here. If you take your knife and you come in just by the tail of your steak here, just in a little bit, you can hit that seam that where the cap covers your chuck eye. You can see that seam right there. If we follow that with the knife and cut right along that fat seam, you should pretty easily be able to pull the chuck eye section away from your cap muscle. You just keep rolling that out and following it along with your knife until you get that completely pulled apart. Alright, now this piece here that I got my hands on, now that I got it separated from the cap, this piece would actually be considered your chuck eye roast. Maybe you'd trim just a little bit more fat off of it, but that there is your chuck eye roast. And like I said before, if this section right here had a little bit more meat on it, I would have cleaned it up, cut it in about 2-inch squares, and then used it as boneless short ribs, but there just wasn't enough meat. Alright, now that we have the chuck eye separated from the cap muscle, we're going to go ahead and cut this into steaks. This is what's considered sometimes the butcher's secret steak. A lot of people don't really understand that this is the same muscle that is your ribeye muscle that connects to the other side where they break it at the 7th rib. Now these steaks here, they're full of flavor, they're tender, but the problem is you only get a couple steaks out of a whole boneless chuck roll. So like here I got 4 steaks, that's it. That's maybe one package. So the rest of this I'm going to have to use for boneless chuck steaks or chuck roasts, or whatever I need it for. I mean, most people don't understand that when they go to the grocery store and they say, hey, I want a package of chuck eyes. Well, unless I'm going to cut a whole chuck, I'm not going to just cut the end off of it for somebody just for some chuck eye steaks. But if you see them in the meat case, grab them up because that's a perfectly good steak. Next here we're cutting our boneless chuck steaks, anywhere from about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. Now if you notice here on the top portion of this boneless chuck steak, right above that fat line, if you were to cut that along that fat line and separate that top rectangular portion out and cut it about 1.5 inches thick, that's what they consider a Denver steak. It's still part of your boneless chuck steak, but that's where they separate it at. We'll get maybe one more boneless chuck steak here, and then we'll go ahead and get a couple nice boneless chuck roasts. So there we got four nice center cut boneless chuck steaks, and just by cutting it thicker, it's considered a chuck roast. It's the same as a steak, it's just cut thicker. Get some of that trim off there. All right, there's a nice center cut boneless chuck roast, and maybe we'll get one more off here, because once you get back to the heel of the boneless chuck roll, it's got, you know, a lot of gristle and sinew and stuff, and it doesn't make a very appealing roast. So there we go. We got a couple nice chuck roasts there. We got 4 boneless center cut chuck steaks, and we got 4 nice chuck eye steaks. This last piece here, I'm just going to chunk it up. I don't need any stew meat, or I'd make some stew. Right now I'm just going to chunk it up and use it for some trim, make some ground chuck out of it. Again, if you found this video at all helpful, come on over here and click on the little subscribe button, and then click on the little bell icon. That way you'll be notified of future uploads. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.